G Barb's podcast. Today's guest is Kristi Charish. Hi, Kristi.
Hey, Brooke, how are you? Thank you so much for
Good.
having me.
Thank you for coming on. So, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm a Canadian. I think you've had a couple of Canadians on the show recently.
Yes.
Um, so I'm an urban fantasy novelist from British Columbia, so I'm on the wet coast. And I originally started off my sort of career life as a scientist. So as a geneticist, I did a PhD in cell biology and genetics, and I was doing research for about 10, 15 years. Um, and how I ended up becoming an urban fantasy author is while I was writing up my PhD thesis, I realized that I loved doing all the sciencey research stuff in the lab. It was a blast, but I didn't want to become a professor, which was kind of the next step in my career, which was writing grants, not doing fun experiments, and teaching. And that wasn't really quite what I wanted to do. So what ended up happening was I was like, well, let's play fantasy career. If I could do anything I wanted on the planet, anything at all, and it wouldn't feel like a job, what would it be? And I was like, well, I love reading sci-fi and fantasy. I love, I love that whole world of fiction. Wouldn't it be amazing if I could write fiction, be an author? That was kind of like a dream career. So while I was writing up my degree, I did, I would give myself an hour of fun free time writing, and then I do an hour of my PhD thesis. And very quickly it turned into 2, 3 hours of fun writing and 1 hour of my PhD thesis. But by the time I defended and got my degree, I also had a novel.
Wow.
So yeah, so I finished the novel and I sent it out to agents, not really ever thinking anything would happen in that area. I figured, you know what, it'll be fun. I'll learn how to self-publish, but first I'm going to try the agent pathway. I got an agent, and she sold my first series to Simon and Schuster, which was Owl and the Japanese Circus. And so I've kind of never really looked back. I do use my degree in my fiction, not quite the way I think it was ever intended to be used, but yeah, so that's me.
Wow. That's amazing. So, where do you get your ideas from when you think of your stories?
Everything around me, like a lot, it ends up kind of being a bit of a, I don't know, like a blender of everything going on around me. It's like in my earlier books, my Owl series, there's a lot of sort of allusions to grad school and sort of the grad school experience and the school experience and some of the things that were great about it and some of the things that were not so great about it. And just you know trying to get out of that academic world, and then just plus my love of things like Indiana Jones and video games like Uncharted, and yeah, so that it ends up becoming this blended mixture that resembles none of the above, um, but is inspired by them, and most of my books are like that.
Wow, that's amazing. So, what did your family think of you transitioning from, a scientist to an author? Like,
Um, I think initially, I think it's a great question, and I don't think anybody's ever asked me that before. Um, and you're right. I think they were very skeptical to begin with, because I've gone through this whole process of doing degrees, and I've been in grad school for a fairly long time, and that was what I was trained in, doing research in a laboratory. And now I say I want to write fiction, and the success rate for writing fiction is not great. It's you know for everybody who really tries, there are a ton of phenomenal authors out there. And luckily with self-publishing, more of them are getting their voices out there. But when when I kind of started out, it was, how many people actually get to the agent point? And even if you have an agent, you may never sell a book.
Yeah.
I think they figured it was going to be a hobby. And
Yeah.
I think they figured I'd give it a shot. I'd send some books out there. And of course, I'd get rejected. And then I'd move on to something else. Um, you know, some of my family. But I think once I got that first publication, it quickly turned around into, oh, okay, this is happening. And they're incredibly supportive. Like, I mean, my family's very, very supportive. But I think that first reaction, probably from my mom, again, trying to be as supportive as possible. Nobody said you shouldn't do this, but I think it was okay, she's going to try this for a while, and it's eventually it's going to end, and then it'll be end. And now I've got 7 books out there, so I'm stuck with it.
That sounds like my mom. She's like, oh, well, right now that's your hobby. I was like, Mom, but I want to make this my career. And she's like, well, being a journalist, being in people's business can get you killed. And I'm like, yeah, but that's what I want to do. Like, so yeah, it's good to have family support you. It really is. She finally supports me after she listened to a few of my interviews.
That's awesome.
So,
Well, journalism is so incredibly important nowadays.
yeah.
Like, I mean, just integrity in journalism. It's we need more journalism out there, not less. It's like,
Exactly. So, what inspired you to write your most recent novels?
the most recent the most recent release I've had is VOODOO Shanghai, which came out last year, and that's in my KINCAID Strange series. That one, it's the 3rd book in the series, and it's so KINCAID is a practitioner who channels the dead, and she's she lives in Seattle, and her roommate is the ghost of a grunge rocker.
Oh,
And so she chats with her job is she raises zombies, and for will disputes and things like that. So it's sort of the practical of why would you want a ghost? Well, will disputes, and where's the money, and things like that. Very mundane things. And part of what kicks off the first novel is there's a murder that happens, and very quickly practitioners in the city start getting roped into it, and they become suspects, and they also start turning up, become the victims. So KINCAID's got to figure out how to solve these murders before she ends up next in line or blamed for all of them. So the 3rd book has her in Portland. Portland, I was itching to use it throughout my series. So Seattle was kind of the kick. Seattle, the underground city. And the history of the underground city and the history of sort of frontier Seattle and Portland were huge inspirations for the series. I kind of joke. I've joked before that the people who were living on the West Coast in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, were possibly the most damnably creative bunch who've ever settled North America. Just the creativity and just some of the things that went on. Just the ghosts of those people who sort of haunt these underground cities, which are still there, and you can go visit. So if you're ever in Portland or Seattle, you can do tours of these underground cities that are just were kind of buried over when as the city developed. But Portland had this really wild thing that was going on in the late 1800s, and it's where the term Shanghai came from. So the title of the book is VOODOO Shanghai, and the Shanghai bit is a term that came out of Portland for what would happen to sailors. So there was a route for the ships, which was Portland to Shanghai. And it was one of those routes that just took for so long. Nobody wanted to do it. The sailors, as soon as they got to Portland, they'd hop off the ship. No way are they going to Shanghai. And part of it had to do with it was just such a long voyage. So, you might run out of food, you might get scurvy. It wasn't a good, trip, and you might not be back for 3 years. So, yeah. So, but here you have all these ship captains, and Portland's the last stop, and they need sailors to get them to to Shanghai. And there was so the people in some of the people in Portland saw a business opportunity where what they would do is you would have a rooming house or a bar or maybe even a brothel, and people would come in, people from the forestry industry at the time, travelers who were coming through looking for work, maybe even people going up to the gold rushes, that sort of thing. And they'd come through your bar, and you'd quickly pick out the people who maybe didn't have family or didn't have, ties to Portland itself. And so, you'd be, say a logger who's in town, and you get a drink, and, maybe somebody buys you beer and you start getting drowsy, and you really get drowsy, and then the floor drops out from underneath you, and you can still go see these, and you might wake up in this cage. You'd either do one or two things. You could wake up in a holding cage, or you would wake up on the ship, and it was too far off from shore. You're on that ship, and the term was being Shanghaied, because you would wake up on a ship, and now you're a sailor because you can't get off. And it's when you think about it, it's dark. It's a horrible thing to have happened to people. So I wanted to use the setting, and I wanted to use a bit of that history, where all of a sudden the ghosts who are supposed to live in Portland start to go missing, and what's happened to them. And that's what Kincaid is sent down to Portland to try and figure out, is where are all these ghosts going, who's taking them. And so that's sort of what it's about, is her trying to find out why they're going missing.
That's amazing. So do you have these in audiobooks too? I would like to listen at work.
I do. No, Audible did them with a really great narrator, Susanna Jones, who does them. Audible did a great. I loved working with Audible on both my series. So yes, wow. They're up there.
That's amazing. Those sound like you should pitch that to like a film director or something, make a series out of it. It's something I would be interested in watching.
Oh, that's incredibly flattering.
So, who are a few of your favorite authors, and have any of them inspired any of your novels?
Yeah, absolutely. Every author I read where I enjoy the book is going to inspire me. Either they're inspiring me to do better, or there are bits and pieces where I'm like, oh wow, that's amazing what they've done with that book. I want to do something like that. Peter Klein's series, his Ex-Hero series, about superheroes and zombies. I really love, plus his the Fold, his whole Fold universe. I'm trying to think. A more historical one. I loved reading James Clavell when I was a kid. So he did the Shogun, Taipan, and one of my all-time favorites, which was King Rat, which was semi-autobiographical, about being in the Japanese internment camps during World War II. So some amazing authors out there. Of course, the urban fantasy greats, Kim Harrison, Faith Hunter, hugely inspiring, and I highly recommend people seek out, who are interested in urban fantasy, seek out some of those authors. Patricia Briggs is another one as well. And I'm trying to think of anything I've read recently that I really love. Hench. and I've forgotten the author's name, but she's Canadian and she is fantastic. She just had a book come out about the henchmen, who go up against superheroes, and it was just a fantastic read. So I highly recommend that. Yeah, I like, there are so many more because I'm just even thinking of my my iPhone and my Audible, Sebastian de Castell is another author. I love his series, the Greatcoats.
Yeah.
And I the way he does sort of that very dramatic, hero's journey, something I tend not to write those hero journeys and those dramatic scenes. But yeah, so yeah, there's a lot of them out there. I always try and tweet. Anytime I read a book I really enjoy, I always try and, at least put some signal out there so that others, pick it up. But yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, in your novels, what was your hardest scene to write and why?
That's you are very good at this.
I think that stumps everybody. Like they're like
Hey,
thinking about it. They're like,
but it's such an important question to ask too, it's because everybody's got the hard scenes. Everybody's got, a scene they just struggle through. Romance scenes are always hard for me.
Yeah.
Every and all romance scene. And not to encourage, that this is a good way to handle romance scenes. This is not an instructional kind of thing. But, my way of dealing with it sometimes is if I've got a romance scene to write, I pour myself a big glass of wine and I'm like, all right, I got to do this now. There's something about it. Possibly the hardest scene I ever had to write was in my first Kincaid Strange book. And it's a minor scene. You wouldn't, it's sort of it's on the surface, it almost feels like you could take it out of the book and it might not be, you might not notice it, but it's one of the scenes that was hard to write because it for me at least, it was a big emotional sort of discussion between Kincaid and another character. And I wanted to sum up the crux of their relationship while also writing, almost a scene that I had to balance the emotional stuff, but also I had to balance some violence that occurs in one of these scenes. And anytime you've got, there's action violence, right? Like there's a monster and, or there's action adventure violence, which is very different from writing, anything that's emotionally weighed, because there's almost there's a more serious component to it, which means you have to be really careful about sensitivity. And, what are you writing? And does it need to be in the book? Is it glorified? Those are the scenes that was the scene that took me, I don't want to do spoilers, but in the first Kincaid book, there was a good page scene that just, if it didn't work, the novel wouldn't have worked for me. And those, anything where violence is such a tricky one in writing in general. It's, I kind of think of it as, you never, violence and comedy are really, really tricky in a novel, because in comedy, I think I've heard before, I think it was, I can't remember the screenwriter it was attributed to, but I think it's a really good rule for writers. Never, ever, ever ask your audience to laugh at somebody. Ever.
Yeah.
Ever. That's kind of my cardinal. Like, I mean, that's the rule I always try and follow. You can ask them to laugh at the idiocy of the people around the situation.
Exactly.
You can ask them to laugh at the absurdity of a situation, but you can't ask them to laugh at a person. As soon as you do that, I don't know, for me, you've crossed a line. It's,
Exactly.
you know, and there's violence, I think, has a very similar, it has a parallel issue. When as soon as you're writing violence for entertainment, purely for entertainment, you want to see like a cage match.
Yeah.
That's, for me, that's not okay. If it's coming across a cage match, or there's an entertainment factor to the violence itself, that's not okay. It's got to be there to highlight something else. There's got to be a really good reason for it. And again, in an action adventure like The Mummy, the one of my all-time favorite movies, all of the violence is directed, for the most part, in a very self-defense kind of component for the main characters. They're all trying to do battle with this evil that's trying to, assimilate, Egypt in this particular movie, right? And but at no point are they acting violently on people for the sake of acting violently. And I think good adventure movies tend to do that. There is violence, there's guns, but it tends to be, if it's done well, it's directed well. And I don't know. In some areas there could be, and maybe it's just my age catching up with me, but I kind of feel that in some arenas there can be sort of a glorification of violence now, and so I'm always we've gotten into a much longer answer than
Well,
what I intended, but yeah,
I agree with you, because if I see a lot of violence in a book, then I'm completely like triggered by it a little. So yeah, it does steer me away from the book and maybe want to skip over it. So I agree with you and I understand. So yeah, definitely.
yeah, and I think too, just there are so many more conversations now that are happening around, how art and how the media and how everything can make people feel. And I think they're productive because, as an author, I started writing sort of as a hobby in 2010. And I am, I can say that over the past, as my careers, evolved, I've become much more aware that, when I write, and a lot of this has been encouragement from, writing instructors and feedback from writing groups. But yeah, I think the conversations that we're having in, in the world make everybody consider, or I hope make artists, authors, film, people in film and TV consider things more before they just put it onto paper or film. Because what is just, an adventure scene to you, to me, is not the same thing to somebody else. And yeah.
I agree with you. Yeah, definitely. I want to thank you so much, Kristi, for coming on my show and speaking about your books.
Thank you so much for having me, Brooke. This has been fantastic.
You have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye. Hey, everyone. I want to thank you all so much for listening to my interview with Kristi. So if you would like to purchase her books or her audiobooks, that's awesome audiobooks, you can refer to the link that's tinkering below, and you can check out all of her work. You can contact her. You can join her newsletter. You can listen. I mean, you can not listen. You can read her reviews, you can read her blogs, you can contact her, all on her website. That's all on that link right there. I want to thank you all so much for your support and for supporting my podcast. I really greatly appreciate it. Feel free to comment, share, and like. And I hope you all have a great day.